In the spring of 2003, the nation was still reeling from the impact of 9/11. Just as Americans began to grapple with the reality of a second war in Iraq, an independent panel of 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, 9 white men and 1 white woman, gathered at the Alexander Hamilton U.S. Custom House in Manhattan, just down the street from the site of the former World Trade Center, to ask one question. What went wrong? Over the next 10 months, the group heard from survivors, experts, academics, and representatives of the New York City police and fire departments. They struggled to gain access to all of the information they needed. For example, taped interrogations of al-Qaeda operatives it was later revealed the CIA had destroyed.
This man, Jose Rodriguez, the CIA's top operations officer, had ordered the destruction of the tapes.
On July 22, 2004, the Commission's 570-page, 14-chapter report was released. It concluded that the terrorist attacks of September 2001, quote, were a shock, but they should not have come as a surprise. The most important failure of the United States, said the report, was one of imagination. We do not believe leaders understood the gravity of the threat. And by understood, what they really mean is that those who knew didn't take it seriously. Bin Laden had threatened. The CIA had warned the president. NORAD, the organization that protects our airspace, had even run a training exercise in the years leading up to 9/11 that simulated a plane being crashed into the World Trade Center. We mentioned at the start of this season that here on Things That Go Boom, we were caught off guard by the devastating impact coronavirus has had on all of our lives. An impact that is actively reshaping the world as we know it. But we shouldn't have been. Just like the other threats we've covered this season, from disinformation to mercenaries to nuclear war, and just like 9/11, experts were out there warning us about a pandemic. They were even out there warning us about a pandemic that might be created by a novel coronavirus. And so the fact of the matter is that we set out this season with the wrong question. Right now, the last thing we all should be asking is, what else are we missing? Because too many of the biggest threats we face today are actually just sitting there in plain sight. On this episode of Things That Go Boom, we get down to the brass tacks of the real problem with this idea of great power competition and what it means when we choose to ready for one kind of war and roll the dice on everything else.
What is actually going on with the economy nowadays? The price of gas? Inflation? Are we in a recession? I'm Jeff Guo, co-host of NPR's Planet Money. Come along with our super team of econ experts as we delve into the stories that show you how the world really works. That's Planet Money from NPR.
If 2020 has helped us all realize here in America that our priorities are out of whack, it stands to reason that figuring out our next step means taking a closer look at the crisis that's threatened our health security, our economic security, and our standing in the world.
Disease and affects everyday life, and I think it's just been underestimated just how far-reaching it could be and how important it is to prepare.
That's Gigi Quick-Grunwald. She's a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security and an immunologist by training.
These health crises are really integral to national security and have such far-reaching effects because we keep saying that diseases know no borders, but it's just true because people interact with people and they transmit disease.
Gigi says this isn't the last pandemic we're going to face. And she's not the only one sounding that alarm. Experts have warned that as the polar ice caps melt, thousands of dormant diseases that have been frozen inside them for centuries lay waiting to become the next pandemic. So how can we do better when the next one hits? Well, Gigi says we have to start by getting at some structural problems. For example, our health experts and security experts haven't always played well together.
We started the global health security agenda with other nations that took this approach about there's a security dimension to disease, but you don't see this as part of the expertise of the people who are trained in national security. It's like it stops at bombs and maybe some understanding of biological warfare, but it doesn't really extend to like these pervasive challenges.
And since our focus is generally stopped at biological warfare, like the part where we think about the weapons that might actually be used to fight, we've totally failed to do the kind of research we should into the other side of biological war, the defensive side. Like, say, the potential to make countermeasures against disease that might protect us in the event of a biological attack, but also might protect us right now, in the middle of a pandemic.
I mean, in some cases in DoD, there are problems with people who have a background in the biological sciences. They cannot get to leadership positions high enough to have that nexus. In 2001, one of the people who was in charge at the Department of Health and Human Services to get a smallpox vaccine and to get an anthrax vaccine going, that was General Phil Russell. And he had a long career in the Army, obviously, doing vaccine development, but you could not get to that rank now and have that his background. The Army made these changes that there is no promotion pathway to that level.
There's not actually a career track for health security, or what might be called biosecurity, in DoD, like there is for nuclear and chemical officers. There never has been. According to Gigi, General Russell got there by caring intensely about the job and working for decades to protect soldiers from infectious diseases. But the changes Gigi's referring to, which were put in place during the Clinton administration, essentially eliminated even that informal career track in other health-related fields at DoD, which means inside the Department of Defense, the folks thinking about health security broadly defined are pretty junior. And a lot of them are contractors, rotating in and out of a job they might not be quite so committed to as a longer-term role. This makes it tough to make any progress institutionally, and maybe more importantly, it means that the mission, the whole idea of things like pandemic preparedness at DoD, is lacking in advocates at the top. In some ways, health security doesn't even appear to have a seat at the table. And that's not even the worst of it. So what is the biggest problem that you face in sort of building up government capacity to respond to biological threats and pandemics?
Well, funding. The budgets for CDC have been cut.
Now the CDC will reportedly scale back work in dozens of foreign countries amid funding worries.
President Trump's proposed budget plan could threaten America's ability to fight health threats.
Even before we had whatever is going on with our pulling out of the WHO, that budget has been cut. You can't starve public health and then expect it to be there to solve your problems.
In my time as a think tank researcher, I led a working group to look into the many ways in which the fight against terrorism had permeated our government. We found that in the years after 9/11, from 2002 to 2017, the U.S. spent an average of almost $190 billion a year on counterterrorism. And that's just counterterrorism, not the defense budget as a whole, which was $700 billion. So even though we were caught off guard by 9/11, we went all in right after. And around that same time, when we were spending all of this money playing whack-a-mole with terrorist organizations around the world, the National Academy of Medicine commissioned a study that suggested that an additional investment of $4.5 billion a year could help safeguard the U.S. against the devastation a pandemic might cause. That's just $4.5 billion.
We've been taking away our ability to respond to these things for some time. And public health officials are always overworked and understaffed and under-resourced. But now we're just going to face a lot of burnout unless we build this capacity up.
The CDC's budget, even in a good year, is tiny, about $6.5 billion. So taking a look at shortfalls in pandemic preparedness is probably a good idea. But 9/11 also serves as a good reminder that the most recent threat isn't the only one we have to worry about. Remember those polar ice caps? All those diseases just waiting to be unleashed upon the world? Well, they're just one consequence of a much bigger set of problems that we already know are coming down the pike.
Climate change is among the most serious threats we face today, along with COVID.
Sherry Goodman is the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security and a senior fellow at the Wilson Center and the Center for Climate Security. She says we're already feeling the impacts of climate change here at home.
We begin tonight with Tropical Storm Isaias lashing the Florida coast and preparing for a dangerous run north along the East Coast.
Millions waking up in the dark after Isaias raced up the East Coast.
Off the east coast of Florida tonight, blowing trees and debris, sustained winds now at 70 miles per hour.
Heavy rains quickly flooding roads and trapping drivers.
Of course, this battle against Mother Nature comes as Americans remain locked in a battle against COVID-19.
That is already a challenge for our first responders and for people in harm's way that might need to shelter. But because of COVID, it's not so safe for people to shelter in closed spaces. So there are now efforts to keep people out of shelters, which might put them more at risk.
The U.S. military is feeling the pain too.
Last year, major hurricanes tore through the hangars at Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, where our F-35s and other fighters are based. And as a result, we lost a number of fighters to damage and we lost a number of hangars. That base is going to require billions of dollars to repair and reset to a higher level of wind speed.
Told me $8 billion worth of damage has been done to a number of military installations in the last 12 months. The insidious menace behind this destruction? Climate change.
We're seeing nuisance flooding at high tide on sunny days. We are seeing in some of the large military installations like Norfolk, transportation routes being hampered and military personnel can't get to their posts.
Why does the Navy care about sea level rise? It's like, well, we're the Navy. We tend to build our bases at sea level. I mean, it's just kind of a fact of that's where you put ships.
According to the Office of Management and Budget, we spent about $13.2 billion on climate change in 2017. But of the 6 agencies more closely reviewed, 94% of reported climate change funding went to programs that, quote, touch on but aren't dedicated to climate change, such as nuclear energy research. And here's the thing. No threat is a certainty. You could say, hey, we've been talking about that asteroid that might hit Earth for years, right? Why aren't we investing in that? And in some ways, you'd be right. But we have finite resources. We have to choose. And so every year, when the president submits a budget to Congress, that president is making a choice, a statement of values. We can choose to buy more weapons, expand our military presence overseas, or we can choose to siphon off some of that money to things like pandemic preparedness, climate change. Those are the choices we make. The budget, in effect, is policy. And every choice has risks for the people impacted.
When I was Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, we released and issued the first and so far only environmental justice plan for the Department of Defense. That was back in 1995. And that was a very forward-looking plan in 1995. That said, that was a quarter century ago. It's time to update that plan to ensure that disadvantaged communities around America receive, the benefits of clean energy, energy efficiency, that contaminants around them are cleaned up, you get affordable and sustainable housing. I mean, there's a lot we can do once we understand those environmental justice impacts affecting our communities.
Confronting this national challenge is likely to mean committing to it in a way that we haven't before.
It's got to be a key part of everything we do, and it can't just be an add-on. In the past, it was seen as not central to our foreign and national security policy, and it was something for the environmental technocrats to address in their own silos. But it can't be a sideline anymore. It has to be central. And then at the same time, we need to understand what we need to do in the near term to mitigate the worst effects on the most deeply affected communities.
There are a lot of things that traditionally haven't been seen as central to our foreign and national security policy. Pretty much anything that qualifies as domestic policy, for example. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about America's most deeply affected communities. We'll also talk about what our domestic policy has to do with great power competition and one of our biggest weaknesses that's hiding in plain sight right here at home.
A few years ago, when I was the director for the House Subcommittee on Africa, we took a trip with members of Congress to Egypt. And at that time, Sisi was the president of Egypt. And they've been having protests since the so-called Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings began. And the trouble was that he was having a very powerful and violent response to protesters.
That's right. 1,400 people have been detained since Friday's protest, and a worrying number of prominent critics have been detained.
And so the members of Congress were essentially grilling him about his treatment of protesters. And so he listened to this kind of tough love lecturing that he was receiving. But he had a kind of a sly smile on his face. And at the end of that presentation from the members of Congress, he said, "I have one question for you all." And they said, "Sure, Mr. President, what is your question?" And he said, "What about Ferguson?"
Despite calls for protesters to remain peaceful, Ferguson was met with chaos. Gunshots kept firefighters at bay for quite a while as at least a dozen businesses went up in flames.
You must disperse immediately or be subject to arrest.
And he was making a reference to the fact that Ferguson, Missouri was on fire, with armored, militarized police in the street, tear gas canisters, rubber bullets, batons going upside the heads of protesters that were protesting the police killing of Michael Brown. And he was essentially saying to them, how can you be in my country as a moral exemplar for the treatment of citizens who want to protest, when in fact an American city is on fire right now for the exact same reason?
That's Travis Atkins, a lecturer of African and Security Studies at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And he says there is really no foreign policy issue that doesn't have a domestic analog.
We need to end the fiction that our domestic and our foreign policies are somehow separate from each other.
And recognize that we can't continue to do nation building in these regions. Part of American leadership is making sure that we're doing nation building here at home.
Foreign policy is also domestic policy for so many of us.
Whether you're talking about trade or conflict or trafficking or governance, all of the things we do and don't do at home have resonating or spillover effects in other parts of the world.
But the conversation Travis is referring to in Egypt about Ferguson, it's nothing new.
It's not a new conversation, and many in our society have been having this conversation literally for centuries because we have not dealt with one of the greatest unresolved sins of American society. Racism writ large, but specifically white supremacy. And so if you look at every movement, not just for civil rights or racial equality, but for marriage equality or for women's suffrage or women's rights, all of these people have been saying there is a huge gap between who we say we are and who we actually are.
That gap makes it hard for us to stand up for the things we say we believe in, like human rights.
Because how can we do that when we are not abiding by those things? I also think it gives fuel to the fire of nations who oppose democratic governance, who oppose some of the ideals that the United States says that it upholds.
In November of 2019, the New York Times published 400 pages of leaked documents that revealed, among other things, that China's President Xi had been taking notes on the U.S. war on terror, using it to justify China's mass detention of Muslims in Xinjiang.
Up to 1.8 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities have been sent to the camps since 2017.
Well, it's probably the largest internment of an ethnic or religious minority since the Holocaust.
That means 24/7 video surveillance, watchtowers, and double-locked doors.
And more recently, it's come to light that President Trump might have encouraged Xi to go ahead with building a series of brutal detention camps in the region.
Tyrants and despots and dictators, they're going to do what they're going to do regardless of what the United States does. But when from the kind of bully pulpit of our presidency or our top foreign policy officials, we give them political cover, then it becomes very dangerous. And so nations who already had a lockdown on journalists, who already had a lockdown on protest and dissent, what happens when they see the nation that is supposed to be the global leader in human rights and democratic governance, and they're saying journalists are the enemy of the people?
I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are.
When they see us doing the opposite of what we're saying that they should do, then you can imagine that our words will ring a lot more hollow and be ineffectual.
I do really struggle to take our government seriously when it comes to that sort of like watchdog type statement when we're failing so miserably to do these very basic things within our own borders.
That's Marissa Conway, the co-founder of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. She says it doesn't have to be this way.
So feminist foreign policy is a political framework, and it's really centered around the well-being of marginalized people, which includes gender, but also includes things like race and sexuality, class, ability. For example, how these social categories are key determinants of a person's ability to either have access to that power or be prevented from accessing that power.
Marissa says that this approach leads to some pretty simple and fundamental changes in the way countries do business. Take this idea of great power competition.
This entire framework is based around the idea that power is finite. And so much of our world order is currently constructed on these various states continually trying to get power over the other. It's just all about domination. And so a feminist approach would look at this and say, like, okay, well, power isn't finite. It actually exists in abundance, and it's something that we can share. So instead of competition, here are these opportunities for collaboration.
Feminist foreign policy first took hold in Sweden. In 2014, the country became the first to implement an approach that places equality at the center of almost every diplomatic decision it makes. For example, when coronavirus hit, Sweden moved to fund an impending shortfall in contraceptives, putting a priority on sexual and reproductive health when the idea might not have even occurred to other states. Of course, prior to its implementation of a feminist foreign policy, Sweden was already domestically pretty bought into the idea of gender equality, with, for example, 3 months of parental leave for each parent and an entire government agency, Sweden's Equality Ombudsman, tasked with overseeing laws regarding discrimination and equal rights. When you think about structurally and within our government, what are some of the biggest challenges that you see to getting there, to implementing a feminist foreign policy in America?
I think a general lack of buy-in for equality is one of the biggest. And it makes me so sad to say this, but I really don't think equality is really valued throughout American society. We are a very kind of individualistic society, and there's a big sense of like everyone needs to be out for themselves. And the idea of equality or equity is still very threatening to a lot of people who think that if they give up this abstract concept of power, they're not going to get everything they want in life.
I'm not sure that most Americans really grasp even how new full democracy is, even in our own country.
That's Travis again.
At 44 years of age, I am the first person to be born with the full rights of citizenship in my own family. And my family has been in America since at least 1827. So in 200 years, no one in my family was born free until I was in 1975.
Yeah.
We're celebrating now this year the centenary of women's suffrage, right? And of course, that was white women specifically. 244 years of independence, all women have only had the right to vote for 100 of those years, right? Black Americans have really only been full citizens for about 55 years. And so even for us, we pride ourselves on this notion of a long democratic process and journey. But again, that all depends on who you ask.
There are lots of people in this country who feel they've been forced to stand on the sidelines of our democracy, and that our domestic policies simply don't value their lives or their contributions.
When we look at our immigration policy and the way in which it is racialized, not just by the current administration, but throughout its history, every time we talk about immigration on television and Congress, it's really always a conversation about the southern border, when the fact is that most illegal immigrants came here legally, flew in on a plane, and simply overstayed their visas. You look at things like the Muslim ban, which is at once racial and religious in the countries that it has selected to focus on. You look at issues like our diversity and inclusion, or lack thereof, in our own foreign policy and national security apparatus. Out of 189 ambassadors that we have in the world right now, only 3 of them are African American, and all 3 of those are men. People tend to be shocked that people like me exist and are doing this kind of work, because it's not the face of America that we have been showing, and that's 100% on us.
Marissa says we need to see a complete domestic overhaul before we can even begin to talk about foreign policy.
Taking national security as an example, it's so heavily focused on militarization and, protecting us from these ideas of abstract violence from somewhere over there. But I think coronavirus has done a particularly excellent job at showing us that the way we understand security, it needs to be dramatically rethought. If we keep, clinging to this narrow and old-fashioned idea of what security means as this very militarized way of doing things, we will forever struggle to thrive as a country, regardless of the size of the defense budget.
We have a choice. It's possible to develop policy in a way that is first and foremost concerned with sustainable peace and the well-being of our most marginalized communities. We just have to be willing, and we have to invest. Remember when I said that a budget is a statement of values? Well, a budget is just a reflection of the choices our leaders make every day. Choices about the things and the people that we value here in America. Remember, over half of our discretionary spending right now goes to what we would traditionally consider defense, to programs at the Pentagon and nuclear weapons-related programs at the Department of Energy. So a lot of this really comes down to where we put our attention and our money.
And so all of the answers really are simple, even if they're not easy, right? They say, what do we do? Well, we don't need a grand treatise from scholars on our foreign policy. This is about providing equal justice under the law and respecting the rights and dignity and decency of all human beings. And if we do that, by definition, our society will be better, we'll be stronger, our partnerships will be better and stronger, and our standing in the world will improve.
Coronavirus has now killed more Americans than died on 9/11. And it wasn't a surprise. In many ways, we just chose to fight terrorism and prepare for another great power war instead. If there's one lesson we've taken away from all of this, it's that in so many ways, we've had our heads stuck in the sand. If we're going to move forward, we have to be willing to think about the whole picture, to not just go all in on one thing, like weapons and wars, or even pandemics. Because in choosing to put all of our weight behind one all-encompassing theory of safety, we leave ourselves open to everything else. But making that policy change is not as impossible as it might seem. Even now, in the middle of a global crisis, and maybe even because this global crisis has opened our eyes, there's reason to believe in the future, to have a little hope.
Hope is, I think, what my community and many others have thrived on for generations. And I think hope is really the only kind of antidote that will help us to create the America that we say we are.
Things That Go Boom is produced by Inkstick Media and distributed by PRX. Our show is produced by Ruth Morris, Maren Lazian, and me. Darian Schulman composes our music, and our engineer is Robin Wise. Thank you, as always, to John Barth for his editorial support. And thanks to the foundations that make our work possible. The Carnegie Corporation of New York, MacArthur Foundation, N Square, and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Cologne Foundation, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. This is our last episode of the season. But never fear, we will be back soon. The Things That Go Boom team is taking a well-deserved break, and we'll be back at it in October, picking up steam just as the U.S. counts down to the 2020 election. In the meantime, we hope you'll keep in touch on social at Inkstick Media, and drop by Apple Podcasts if you haven't already to leave us a review. We're also conducting an audience survey, and this is your very last reminder. I promise that we'll be forever grateful if you could just take a few minutes to visit survey.prx.org/boom and weigh in. That's survey.prx.org/boom. Thank you so much for listening. We really, above all else, are just so grateful for you. So hang in there and stay safe. We'll see you in October. Yeah, I have those little kids. I have a 14-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 19-month-old.
Oh my goodness.
So it's a lot of chasing. We did some Zoom preschool for a while. That was terrible.
How does that even work?
No, it doesn't work.
From